We looked at the last, and if you don't have an Apologetics Press Bible, I have put some copies of the articles. I printed more copies, and they're on the table in the foyer. I think there's 4 there, the black and white ones. And so if you don't have a copy of the article, be sure to grab one. Of course, the gentleman I'm going to mention that we talked about is not in the article. So, Mara Bar Serapion, as we pointed out, he was a Syrian writer who wrote a letter, and in that letter he referenced Socrates, he referenced Pythagoras, and then he referenced the wise man that the Jews killed, the wise king that the Jews killed. And it's generally believed that that reference is Jesus Christ. And he says some things in there with regard to a new law and things like that. The issue with this is there's some question about when the letter was written. If it was written around 73 AD, then it puts them in the 1st century, and it puts them fairly close to the life of Jesus and the establishment of the church. So he would have been more familiar, and yet there's some that would say that it was really not until maybe 166 or so, the mid-160s AD, so the middle to late 2nd century that the letter was written. Again, it doesn't deny then that he referenced Jesus. This wise king still would have been Jesus Christ, could have been Jesus Christ, but it just puts them farther away. Puts them farther away. It's an interesting letter used again to go against the Romans, talk about their tyranny, and referencing the things that can happen there. And his reference, or the Jews by killing their wise king because their kingdom was taken away at that very time. Whether, I'll say this, whether 73 AD or 166 AD, for pagan writers, this man was supposedly, possibly a Stoic, it's actually a pretty pretty well in tune with what happened. I don't know if some Christians could say something like that. So we talked about that. And so that finished what we were calling the Gentile or the non-Christian pagan writers, their references, starting with Tacitus, going to Suetonius, to Pliny the Younger, we looked at Celsus, Lucian, and Mara Bar Serapion. One of the things we will reference is that as these writers were generally, at the best, could be said, agnostic toward Christianity, but as the worst, were extremely hostile. Their references to Christianity are not with pleasant thoughts. And we go back to Tacitus, his appearing to rebuke Nero for the things that he did with regard to the Christians, lighting them on fire, was not because they didn't deserve to be punished, but because that this type of punishment caused what among some of the citizens of Rome and the Roman people? Well, convert sympathy toward Christians, which would lead to some conversions. Sympathy. They needed to be punished, but your punishments were too harsh. It wasn't that they didn't need to be punished. It wasn't that they were people that were good people. They were strange and wicked. They were evil people. You know, they did their certain things. So like I said, they were very hostile. But again, when references are made to Jesus with regard to being either the founder of the sect, with regard to, again, Tacitus points out that he was put to death during the reign of Tiberius by Pontius Pilate. What do we find there? We find that Jesus is not denied as a historical figure, is he? There's no denying that Jesus existed. There is, again, rebuke of what these followers were doing and some things like that. They did not deny the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, and thus that's why we're talking about it with regard to the historical Jesus. Then we began looking at Jewish testimony, the Mishnah and the Talmud. The Mishnah was a book of Jewish law or traditions, more or less, codified by the Rabbi Judah around AD 200, known to the Jews as a whole code of religious jurisprudence. And then among this code, written code, they then had written commentary about what these passages meant and this and that, called the Gemaras. And this developed into what they combined them together, and they called that the Talmud. And so from one passage we looked at, and there are other passages more lately, but this is a really good passage to look at, the Sanhedrin 43a. On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged for 40 days before the execution took place. A herald went forth and cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forth and plead on his behalf." But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. So as we mentioned in this passage, there's a couple things that tie in very well with the death of Christ. There's a thing or two that we don't find referenced in the gospel accounts, do we? And that one of the things is the idea that somebody had gone forth, this is a herald, punishment was going to be afflicted upon Jesus within 40 days. We don't find that in the New Testament, do we? But we also note that how is that punishment to be? What was the punishment going to be? What type? They were going to stone him. And again, Yeshu is the Hebrew for Jesus, Yeshua, the Hebrew spelling equivalent of Jesus. So Jesus was hanged. But according to the herald, the announcement was made, he was going to be stoned. And of course, we pointed out that was stoning a common Jewish punishment. Yes, Stephen was what? Stoned. John 8, the adulterous woman was brought before the people. They want before Jesus. We should put him to death. And what did Jesus say? Let he who was without sin do what? Cast the first stone. Even going back to Numbers, when punishment was initiated with regard to violation of the Sabbath, they found the man gathering sticks. What shall we do? They go to Moses. Moses goes to God. Moses says, put him to death. And how did they put him to death? They stoned him. So it's that was the Jewish punishment, method of punishment. And yet it says he was hanged. It says it twice. Well, he hung upon the cross. That ties in with what we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, does it not? Jesus hung upon the cross. And yes, we say, well, wasn't he crucified? Well, yes, that's true, and that's probably the better term to use, but we find a couple of examples. For example, in Galatians chapter 2, verse 13, for it is written, again, he's referencing to Christ, and again, the type of punishment that he underwent. How was it looked upon by the Jew? Cursed is everyone that hangs on a tree. That Greek word hanged, a reference to the crucifixion. Paul is referencing the crucifixion. In fact, in Luke chapter 23:39, and one of the malefactors, one of the two thieves that was on the cross, that were hanged, again, they were both on the cross, railed against him, saying, "Art thou not the Christ? Save thyself and us." So the term hanged is used in the New Testament when the situation is what? They were put upon the cross. They were put upon the cross, and they had nails put within their wrists and in their ankles and this and that. So, this passage points out that Jesus was hanged, which we find in the gospel. When was he hanged? Passover Eve, which what day of the week would that be? Friday, the 6th day of the week. And of course, he was put on the cross and he died. And before that day ended, they took him off the cross. And Joseph of Arimathea, along with Nicodemus' help, took him and they buried him in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. And they had to do that before Friday evening, before 6 o'clock Friday night. But we would say 6 o'clock Friday night. Why? Because if they hadn't done by 6 o'clock, they wouldn't be able to do it until the first day of the week. Why? Because the next day was the Passover, the 7th day of the week. So, these passages do agree. While it does not go into all the detail that occurs, the detail that is provided agrees with the gospel accounts. And it acknowledges what? That Jesus was a person. This actually happened. That's why it's there. So again, the Talmud gives support to the idea of Jesus existing. And that this Jesus died upon the cross on the 6th day of the week before the Passover. You should also note there are other passages that give reference to the idea that Jesus had disciples. And of course, when you look at the gospel account, what did Jesus have? He had disciples. So now we're getting to the one that's really interesting. Josephus. And I bought my big, new complete works of Josephus, and I can walk around with this and really look impressive, can I not? I can look really, wow, look at what he's reading there. And I actually have something marked, but it's not the passage I was reading. And please note, this is a fairly small lit package. It's just double column, so Josephus wrote a lot. So who was Josephus? Well, he was a first-century Jew. He was born in Jerusalem around AD 37. So depending on when you date the death of Christ on the cross, it was either about 7 years or 4 years after death, but just a few years after he died. His birth name was Yosef ben Matthias, and that was one of his father's names. Both sides of the family were of the tribe of Levi. He was of a priestly tribe. Appears that it was a highly esteemed tribe. If you read the life of Flavius Josephus, which is his autobiography, which he wrote, it appears that he maybe wrote this because some were claiming that he was not of high esteem, maybe. I have started reading this. I will make this comment. We talk about how there's not much regarding Jesus and his first 30 years of life. But I will say that Josephus, given the chance to write his own biography, doesn't say much about his first 26 years of life or so. He does make an interesting claim. I'd like to read this. This is from section 2. I'm not sure exactly how we call those divisions. I'm going to call it section 2. It's pretty early. If you went online and said, the life of Flavius Josephus, it'd be near the beginning. So that would help you out there. It'd be like number 2. Now, my father, Matthias, was not only eminent on account of his nobility, but had a higher commendation on account of his righteousness, and was in great reputation in Jerusalem, the greatest city we have. Of course, I'll make this comment. When he writes this, possibly a better term might have been, we had, because he writes this after the destruction of Jerusalem. I was myself brought up with my brother, whose name was Matthias, for he was my own brother by both father and mother, and I made mighty proficiency in the improvements of my learning, and appeared to have both a great memory and understanding. Now, I'm gonna try to read this a little slower. Moreover, when I was a child, and about 14 years of age, I was commended by all for the love I had in learning, on which account the high priest and principal men of the city came then frequently to me together in order to know my opinion about the accurate understanding of points of the law. Now, please note, do we not have young people that are, we would like to use the term boy genius, a more modern cultural reference? We might call somebody a Doogie Howser, an old TV show where Neil Patrick Harris was 12 years old when he graduated from medical school, was a doctor and all that stuff. I didn't watch the show, but I know about it. I know the reference and all that. So sometimes young people can be really great memories and this and that. I did, though, find it interesting how that someone might parallel with what other account in the first century might this parallel, we might think. 14 years old, great understanding, the priests come to me. How about the New Testament? How about Luke chapter 2? Somewhere around 46 and 47, where it says, but it came to pass in those days that after 3 days they being who? What people? His parents, Joseph and Mary, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors or teachers, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all that heard them were astonished at his understanding answers. So that sounds of course, there's a difference, is there not? It appears that we might think that, well, Jesus went in and told them everything, but what does it really say about what Jesus did? Jesus got there, he saw these men, he was asking questions, and we don't know what kind of questions he's asking about. Interesting, he could have been asking about the possibility of the Messiah coming, he could have been asking about the traditions of the Pharisees, some of these, there's a lot, we don't know what he asked. But what does it say? It says he said he had, in asking and answering, making it, it appears he had a great understanding of what was being talked about, and that when he replied or when he answered the comments they made, he had some great answers, very short. But it doesn't say what. He told them what to do. Whereas Josephus, if you read it, and it could be because some people, they have a great memory. Can you exactly tell me this? And that person that had a great memory could maybe quote something right off. But if you read it, and again, this could be the English translation, I don't know how it takes, it really makes them sound like boy genius, Josephus, and that when the high priest had a problem, who did they call? Josephus. And when the principal man of the city called, who did they call? Josephus. I don't know. I'll just make this comment. If he gave him advice based upon the fact that they so this was around 51 AD. He was 14, born 37, 51, 52 AD. Coming another 10 to 15 years, the Jews are rebelling against the Romans, and then 4 years or so later, Jerusalem is destroyed, and so I don't know what kind of advice, his advice led to that. But maybe that's why then he doesn't really say much more. But I just found that really interesting. Interesting path. And like I said, he does not say very much. He then talks about that he became a Pharisee at around age 19. But at age 16, he decided to investigate the sects of the Jews. And so what sects would he have probably looked at? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and he mentions one other one. Not the scribes, not Christians. The what? Okay, the Essenes. So the bunch that hung around quorum, around the Dead Sea Scrolls and this and that, the ones that were very separated with regard to that. He mentioned something, a person, appears he may have been an Essene. He doesn't say very much, but he says by the age of 19, he then became a Pharisee. I don't know exactly how that worked, but it just says he became a Pharisee. Of course, if his father was of the position that he was, and his mother, this, that, it probably wasn't very hard for that. At age 26, so this would have been around 80, 64, he traveled to Rome. In his travels, he and Paul shared the same fate. They were shipwrecked. Paul was shipwrecked. So was Josephus. That does not appear to be an uncommon occurrence, though. If you remember, Paul in writing in 2 Corinthians points out he was shipwrecked. And again, please note, when he wrote Corinthians, he's not even counting that shipwreck on his voyage to Rome. So Paul knew there were trouble. So that's not necessarily too bad, different from this, but it is interesting. His travels to Rome, he was shepherd. It appears that he was impressed with the ability of Rome, their strength, the things they offered. But he doesn't, again, say very much. He returns, and now it appears, and like I said, I'm in the midst of this. This is what he starts talking about him being commander of the Jewish forces in Galilee. So in AD 66, when war broke out between the Jews and the Romans, he became the Jewish forces of Galilee. Like I said, I've not gotten really into this. And it appears most of the rest of the writing deals with a lot more of this stuff, his later part of life. Most of the army deserted when the Romans approached. Josephus then went to a fortress, Jotapata, and this fortress, the Roman general Vespasian led a siege against the city. And so some of them were about 40 or so men. They hid out in a cave. And they decided that rather than have the Romans take them and kill them or do whatever, they were going to do what? Imagine what they were going to kill themselves. So they made a suicide pact. And it appears, like I said, I like to read this. I just sort of took this as a basic overview from another article. It appears they may have drawn neat straws or done cast lots or done something to determine the order, So they would do it in order. And so, at the very worst, you'd say that only one man should be living, and then he'd have to kill himself. Well, I don't know how this. Josephus ended up being next to last. He and another guy, and guess what they decided to do? Well, the fact that we talk about him writing these books in the 80s, 90s, his books and this is in the 80s, 60s, tells us it's sort of like watching a TV series. You start watching a TV series, and you see this character on it, and it's like the fourth season, and then you haven't watched the show before, and you go back and you watch the rerun, or start watching it from the beginning, and this guy is in a precarious position. Well, the fact that he's back in season 4 tells me he's going to survive that precarious position. Well, Josephus, he and this other guy agree not to kill themselves. And it appears Josephus wasn't really hip, we might say, to killing himself. They had to use a little sword play against him to convince him to join this. And so what does he do? He then is taken captive by the Romans, and he comes in contact with Vespasian, and he makes a prediction that both Vespasian and Titus are going to be Caesars, going to be emperors. Well, and guess what happens? If we look at our Roman history, Vespasian was Caesar. In fact, that's why Titus led the siege against Jerusalem, because Vespasian went back to Rome. And then, of course, after Vespasian dies, guess who becomes the next Caesar? Titus. So was that God-given prophecy? Or was it somebody having some knowledge of what was going on in Rome with Nero committing suicide and some of the confusion there? And that chance, if I was going to look, if you had confusion and infighting, who would probably be a good candidate to take over? A Roman general, would it not? Although today I think when we have these coups, aren't they always like colonels? Colonel Gaddafi. I don't think they were generals. It's usually colonels, I believe. But that's the case. That's what happened. And so he was sort of given some preeminence because of this. Privileged status. Hey, this guy, maybe he knows some things. And again, please note, I am not claiming that Josephus truly prophesied this or had God prophesied. It's probably more likely that Josephus was a smart guy and had some knowledge and could read the tea leaves, what you might say, how things were going, where the winds were shifting. But because of this, he's now gained privilege with the Vespasian. And so if you gain Roman privileges with the Roman, who better than the Caesar? And so he joins Titus as an advisor, as an intermediary during the siege of Jerusalem. Well, how do you think the Jews felt about Josephus then? They don't care for him. He's a traitor. He's a turncoat. But of course, as someone made a comment, he was advising them to give up, and guess what they didn't do? It may have been better for them to give up, but they didn't, and of course we know what happened there. And of course that's because why? Whose hand was involved in that? God's hand was involved in that. I'm not talking about necessarily Josephus, I'm just talking about advice wasn't going to help the situation. God had said, that Jesus had said, Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. And it was. So it doesn't matter how much advice Josephus gave, that was going to happen. So, after the destruction of Jerusalem, he returned to Rome, where he receives Roman citizenship, and he develops a strong relationship with the Flavian family, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. And of course, Domitian is the Caesar who was caused John in AD 96 to be exiled to Patmos. And Domitian was, of the three, he was probably the worst, especially with regard to the church. I say this because we've gone through this, and again, he's written a lot of stuff, has he not? I'm just saying he's mainly 4 writings, but you can see, like I said, if you want to look at the print, double columns, it's a lot of work, and there's some commentary in here by the editor, but mostly his writings. And he's uninspired, so let's make note of that. And like I said, during the gospel meeting, and I haven't gone back to look at that Wednesday night just to get exactly the words that Brother Shanks said, but I sort of gathered that Brother Shanks, and I could have misread it, misunderstood it, sort of takes Josephus, you got to be really cautious around him. I would argue that based upon some of the things, just to give you an example, a number of years ago, my dad and I were talking, and my dad was talking about how he had done some reading, and like Josephus has Moses as some great general like in the Egyptian army. And I went back and read it, and it's some things there. Do we find that in the Bible? No. We do know that there were other writings that were kept by the people of Israel. For example, the book of Jasher. And please note, I've mentioned this, I think, before, with regard to talking about apocryphal books. The book of Jasher that you might find online or there's a book of Jasher. They're frauds. They're fakes. That's been determined. They're fakes. It's interesting reading, but they're fakes. So there could be some things that said that. But he could also be just parroting Jewish tradition. And if they were oral traditions, what could happen? That's one of the things. Sometimes that's one of the great that's one of the great things with regard to looking at the Exodus account. God, how many times tells Moses to write this down? Put it in writing. He says it a number of times. Things are written. Why are they written? Lawyers don't like a lot of times when things are written, because what? It says it there. If you just say orally, if I gave Brother Ricardo you will mow my lawn, I don't have a lawn, so don't have to worry about that, mow my lawn, or at least not one that can be mowed like that, for $100, and it's in writing, we go to court, it's there, But we start talking about each other, Brother Ricardo, well, he said, I think 150, and I said, no, I think I said 50, because it's not in writing, it's he said, she said. So if he's taking things from traditions, and I got to do a little more study on that, I can understand why I'd be rather cautious with regard to some of the things that are written, especially with regard to the antiquity of the Jews, dealing with earlier parts. I do think, though, that some of the things that he probably writes with regard in the first century especially, and maybe even a little bit earlier than that, does help, offers some benefit. It gives some information that we don't have, and that helps support certain things. And so I think the writings that he did, again, talking about the Jewish wars with regard to the Romans and some of the things, they may be exaggerated. They may be exaggerated, they may be wrong in some cases, but he's probably no more wrong or exaggerating than a lot of modern day historians about some of the things they write. So I think there's benefit there. The Jewish people, though, of course, thought him a traitor and a turncoat, and of course, he started writing this after the destruction of Jerusalem, so the numbers of Jews had decreased, but still they were Jews. They did not favor his writings, they did not trumpet his writings. You do find, though, especially later, that early Christian writers did seem to have some agreement with regard to what he wrote, or they liked what he wrote, and so they had some support. So, I've gone through all that because, like I said, and there's more other things you can find. He's an interesting person. And a lot of things that we think about in the first century, that we know about in the first century, in addition to what we find in the Bible, do come from his writings. So he wrote the Jewish War, the Antiquity of the Jews, the Life of Flavius Josephus, and Against Apion. And so, again, a lot of writing. So do we find Jesus referenced in his writing? That's a good question. Does a lot of writing? Do we find it? The Antiquity of the Jews, Jewish Antiquities, Book 18, Chapter 3, Verse 3, or 18:3:3. Allow me to read this, and it's actually, I believe, in the oracle. They did take this out. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man. Very similar to what Marabar Sapirian used the term of that wise king. If it is lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure, he drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. And so we read this passage, and if you read it in the article, what do we note? Well, there's some things in here. If it be lawful to call him a man. So what does that really sound like?
He doubts.
Well, I look at it another way. I think the writing suggests the idea that he's not a man, so if he's not a man, then what would he be? A God, deity. He then writes, he was Christ. He was the Christ. There's another passage there. And then, for he appeared to them alive again the third day. This is after saying he's been put to death. So what does that mean? He rose from the dead. As the divine prophets had foretold these in 10,000 wonderful things concerning him. So if the prophets told him, where could we find these writings? In the Old Testament. So he was, based upon this, was the Messiah, the Christ. And Josephus is stating such. And so obviously then, that's what Josephus said. But some people say what about some of this? First of all, some would say this is an entirely fabricated passage, that it was not Josephus' original writing and that somebody put it in. Some other critics might not go that far, but what might they say? What might they say? Let's say the gist of the passage was written by Josephus. But what might someone do? And please, I'm looking at critics, those who don't believe this. They would say, they don't believe Josephus actually. They would say somebody came back in and did what? Added passages. So they added, if it be lawful to call him a man. They added, he was the Christ. They added, he appeared to them on the third day. They added, the divine prophets had foretold these in 10,000 wonderful things. Now, I'll make one comment. You take these passages out. Well, take those passages out. What, though, do we still have left? There was a Jesus. There was a Jesus. But then the question is, how would we answer these comments? Or what do we need to think about? Could Josephus have written these? If he did, and if he did that mean he was a believer? If he did and he wasn't a believer, why might he have written this? But again, so that's what we'll pick up next week. And that's something we'll give consideration to. But again, pull those out. It still does what? Still shows there's a Jesus. Jesus was a wise man. He did a do of wonderful works. He drew over many Jews, many Gentiles. Now, during his ministry, he didn't necessarily, but with his teachings, he did later. That Pilate had condemned him to the cross. Jesus exists. But so we want to look at that because it is an interesting question. Is it entirely a fabricated passage? If he wrote it, why would he have written it if he was a non-believer? There's a couple answers there. So we'll pick up there, and then we'll look, what are some of the arguments used why they say these passages, this is not a true passage? Because, boy, Josephus really makes it sound like, hey, somebody back there says, well, was Jesus the Christ? Well, let's take the antiquities of the Jews. Josephus wrote it down. Let's put that as point number one. So we'll pick up there next week and talk about that. Thank you so much for your comments, your attention. I greatly appreciate it. And for your information, I will not be bringing this book back. You're already impressed that I'm carrying it around.